Why do I keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result? Isn't that the definition of insanity? Am I mad?
Let it be said that I am a man of my word. So, hi, I'm MangaKamen. Nice to meet you. You might know me as a RWBY hater who's obsessed with RWBY, even though at best I make a single video about the series once a year. So, funny story. About a month or so ago, I made a wager with my audience that if we could help fund some emergency car repairs, I would review Volume 9 of RWBY. And I have to say, I appreciate my audience, cause wouldn't you know it, I was pleasantly surprised with the Volume 2. If you want my opinion straight up, I think this is the best written volume of RWBY out of the 9 volumes. It's certainly better than Volume 8. You really have to try to be worse than Volume 8. That being said, I do think that Volume 9 does have some very glaring issues to it, and a lot of it does stem from when you consider the context of the previous few volumes. And I have an issue with the ending, because sometimes even though the journey can be fun, if an ending's bad, it can ruin the whole experience. So, spoilers ahead. Duh. So I think we should start off by talking about... I do want to give credit where it's due, and I do have to say that I do appreciate the hard work put into things like the animation for this volume. While the fights aren't as memorable as previous volumes, they were still pretty entertaining, especially like against the Red Prince. Considering that we're in essentially what is a filler volume, I do appreciate there's a much more focused lens on the main character of the show. One of the most egregious criticisms that I had and others have about RWBY is that we kind of have a lack of focus on Team RWBY. Even in the earlier volumes, a lot of development was given to side characters like Jean. Granted, I think the fact that if you essentially had to cut off the main cast from everyone else, that was a bit telling on that, but I do appreciate that we're getting character moments such as Ruby Rose finally thinking back on all the terrible things that happened in the previous volume, about how they messed up Penny's death. It's refreshing to see the characters actually be confronted on their mess-ups and look internally about it. Actual character development. The location of the Ever After and all the allusions to Alice in Wonderland is a nice addition to the series. It actually manages to tie into the fairy tale illusion into the setting and plays with the characters who are residential to the Ever After, such as the herbalist being a direct inspiration from the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland,
Who are you?
or Little. Oh yeah, Little is a positive here. I like the Little Mouse. 10 out of 10 would want to have a spin-off to see Little aka Somewhat's adventures. Jean finally gets rid of his banana hair and becomes a lot more competent in fighting.
How did you find us?
How are you the Rusted Knight? And when did you get so
Mature.
You need to be stopped!
Almost a 20-year age gap, huh? Yeah, that's not creepy at all. I feel as though the Curious Cat was a much better villain than what we had in the previous volumes. He was a pretty good manipulator and was doing whatever he could to emotionally break down RWBY so he could use her as a host to escape to Remnant. Oh, and Torchwick showed up. It was nice to see the character back, even if it was a fake. And he was also voiced by the late Billy Kametz. So, rest in peace, bud. There's probably a lot more I'm not bringing up, but I know for a fact that my audience isn't here for me to talk about what I liked about the volume. You're here to ask me about what this volume was bad. Well, my friends, let's begin. So here's something we need to address before we actually talk about the actual issues with the volume, and that's what we need to discuss the stuff from the previous one. For those who don't know, and I don't blame you because it was about over 2 years ago, and I made a video that has over 700k views on it. That's not bragging, I'm just saying. But for those who don't want to watch another 40-minute video going over that, Team RWBY and Friends done screwed up everything. Some of the highlights include making Ironwood so paranoid and acting like the very same people that they claimed they were wrong for lying to people, all the while lying to Ironwood. Not using their brains to negotiate with Ironwood to evacuate civilians with the Schneek Corporation's jets and allow the relic to be out of the hands of the stupidest villain of all time. Trusting someone they've never met before, and making the stress for Ironwood get even worse. Coming up with a stupid plan, which for some reason includes evacuating everyone to a desert in the middle of nowhere instead of one of the better locations in the world. Everyone turned off their brains and forgot about Cinder being around and didn't take that into consideration when coming up with their plan of evacuation, with Penny just standing around like an idiot during said evacuation. Oh, and Penny died. At Jean's hands. She was asking for it. No, literally, she was. I found it kind of bad. Now, I really condensed that, and that's not really the full idea of what my complaints were with that video. It's a 40-minute plus video where I just boiled down my complaints to their cores in this one. But there's a reason why I bring this up. It's easy to view this volume in a vacuum because we're moving away from the actual main plot of the overarching narrative. However, a lot of the issues that our characters, in particular RWBY and Jean, confront in the volume are tied to the previous events that I briefly touched on. So here's the thing. With all these events, with everything happening, if you have an arc like this where the main characters are on their own without most of the side cast to get in the way, or even have the actual plot of the overall show, it's a perfect opportunity to have the characters do some self-reflection about their choices. And to some extent, we do get that. After all, the writers make it perfectly clear that Ruby Rose, the main character, is going through some depression after essentially screwing everything up in the previous volume. This is good. Well, some of it is, I'll go into it later, but I got a lot of issues with Ruby in this volume, especially with the ending of this arc. But what I'll say here is that we really don't get anything for the last volume. We get a few nods and winks to the events, and Weiss even bringing it up in one section, but it's immediately pushed to the side. No addressing the events of the bridge, no talking about lying to Ironwood, which made things insanely worse. Are we going to talk about how the crew was so easily trounced by one of the worst villains in all history and were flung into the ever after? How they could have died if there wasn't an actual story for the audience to follow? Are we going to ignore the fact that Penny died and it was also Jean who killed her? Speaking of Jean, the guy's aged about 10 to 20 years, ripped away from his home and anyone he actually knew. I like this, but are we going to address the mental stress he had to go through? A lot of this is probably being saved for volume 10, and I personally hate that. Because here's the thing, other than finally ending the teasing of the will they, won't they, with Yang and Blake finally hooking up with one of the corniest scenes I've ever seen, this volume comes off as pointless since the character issues were things that didn't make sense. Let me give an example. When the team comes across the herbalist in the 4th episode, they are essentially confronted by younger versions of themselves in an attempt to challenge their sensibilities and tempt them with things in order to make life easier, such as having Weiss be a nobody, Blake becoming either a human or a cat, and Yang getting her arm back. And immediately they shoot these ideas down. Now, you think that may be a good characterization, that the character's experiences prevented them from falling into temptation, except it makes no sense. Weiss, ever since her earlier days, wanted to make the Shnee name great despite what her father did, and she was going to do that by becoming a huntress. Blake only hid her identity as a faunus because she used to be a criminal since she was with the terrorist group the White Fang, and even then, her being labeled as
A bridge between humans and faunus.
doesn't make any sense, especially when you consider the last few volumes. Blake never really did anything to help with the faunus. He was essentially a glorified background character. And there were a ton of opportunities for that to happen since the group was an atlas, the faunus abusing capital of the world, supposedly. And Yang? That's the closest that makes any sense, but still makes little sense since she had already accepted that her arm was gone and had gotten used to her new normal. I understand the focus is to be on Ruby Rose, and to break her down even further and question that she shouldn't be who she is. But it really feels like if you're going to have a scene like this, you should have touched on elements that are more related to things that happened more recently, or make sense to the characters. Like for Yang, since she was the first one knocked off the magic pathway in the last volume, point out how she was too weak to actually protect the ones she cared about since her attempt to save Ruby was ultimately useless since Ruby and her friends are in the ever after. Blake should be questioned about her relationship with Yang and if she sees Yang as an actual love interest or if her feelings are based in pity. I say this not because I'm against the ship, but because it would also tie into the scene later in the volume where she and Yang confess to each other, at least have the groundwork for said confession. And Weiss? Her home was destroyed and she had a hand in that. And we even bring this up a little bit earlier in the volume, but again, brush to the side. If you're going to have a scene like this, you need to actually confront your characters with their mistakes, make them face the repercussions of their actions, or at the very least, make sure they're confronted with things that they are questioning about themselves, and don't throw them softballs. You had a chance to really have the crew be challenged, but nah, these three don't really matter for this volume. Again, it's focused on Ruby and to break her down more and more. One more aspect we'll talk about and we'll move on, but here's the thing. I don't care if you don't think this volume isn't filler. To me it is, since it's disconnected from the actual plot of Salem and the relics. And with how the volume ends, it really gives the feeling that it was just a filler arc because we're going back to the status quo. Again, we'll get to that later, but now we need to talk about Look, let's be honest here. RWBY just sucks with its antagonists. The creators for some reason think that Cinder and Salem are the greatest villains of all time, when one of them is about as developed as a piece of driftwood and the other is so lazy that you wonder why they even have her show up in Atlas. I will say though, the Curious Cat is probably my favorite villain from the series besides Torchwick. Not only because he has a backstory that actually makes sense and is a lot more understanding, but he's also a trickster and works with it. I like that. But this is where we turn to the other villain of the season, Neo. Straight up, Neo is not a character. And it's not because she doesn't have a voice, it's because the writers essentially make her to be nothing more than a tool to be used and thrown away, both in the literary sense and the meta sense as well. So this is going to be going way back a few volumes, back in volume 6, episode 5, when Neo confronted Cylinder for revenge for Torchwick, we get this line.
I didn't kill your boss. If you want revenge, take it up with Little Red.
And Neo just goes with it. Now, I'm sure someone is pointing out, well, RWBY was there when Torchwick died by ironic twist. Maybe Neo just put 2 and 2 together. And that's a fair point. But there were 2 counters to that. The first being, obviously, Neo held Cinder responsible to some degree of responsibility for Torchwick's death. And if she knows that RWBY was there when Torchwick died, why even go after Cinder in the first place? And secondly, how do either of them know Torchwick died? He died being gulped down by a Grimm, something that neither Neo nor Cinder actually saw happen. They never found a body, so how did either of them know that Torchwick died? Maybe there's something in like that book they keep telling me that it's canon that I'm not gonna read because I shouldn't have to because this is a show. I bring this up because there's a large lack of information that's not given to the audience about this supposed character that is Neo. Hell, throughout the previous volumes we see Neo get mistreated by Cinder but sticks with her, and even tosses her away like a tool at the end of the last volume. If Neo was an actual character, you'd think maybe, just maybe, the bitch who manipulated her, threw her away, had a hand in Torchwick's death because he got involved with her, might have been lying about how Torchwick died, about who killed Torchwick. If we're being honest, it was a random Grimm that did the deed and killed Torchwick, but this is information that Neo wouldn't know for certain, and it was clear that Cinder was just using her and lied to Neo's face. Neo is nothing but a tool for the writers to use, much like Salem is. If we're supposed to expect that Neo is being so smart and cunning to essentially have RWBY effectively commit what is on par of that of Hiri in this season, but is too dumb to realize that she should have dropped Cinder like a pound of bricks or even realize that Cinder's a lying bitch, what am I supposed to take from this? And I know there's someone who's out there who's going to bring up the supplemental material that's actually tied to this volume that explains her backstory, and I regret to inform you that is a lazy form of storytelling. Supplemental material should be used to help expand a character and story, not do the heavy lifting for the actual main material of it. One more thing. How does Neo even know these 2 died? Honestly, this volume is really all over the place with these characters and the continuity for them, and there's something to really consider that there were a lot more writers for these episodes, something that's been going on for the last couple seasons. You get the usual of Miles Luna and Carrie Shawcross, but you also had Eddie Rivas and Kiersey Burkhart. Now, I'm not going to say that Luna and Shawcross' writing was perfect for the past volumes, I don't think it was at all. It really wasn't for numerous videos on the internet that will attest to, but the additional writers here really make me raise an eyebrow, especially when they wrote the previous 2 seasons as well. Now, you can enjoy the previous seasons, but if my channel is any indication, you should know that I don't like Volume 7 or 8 for a lot of reasons. In Volume 9, well, while I do appreciate it being a lot more character-driven, and it is honestly a return to form for the animation, it got on my nerves for quite a few reasons, like how nothing really mattered in this volume. I'll go into more depth real soon, but essentially aside from Blake and Yang hooking up, nothing from this volume was really accomplished. Jean, even though he did mature and became a much more powerful badass, goes back to the banana hairstyle and he regresses back to youth. All that angst that RWBY gets just goes away after she commits Sudoku, and yes, that's something that does happen. And Neo remains in the ever after, until she basically gets out of her tree. The more significant thing we learn is that the giant tree in the Ever After is actually what created the 2 gods, and we learn their origins. And it's like, why did we need this information? Okay. Does this information have any effect on the actual plot of Salem? Does it offer a solution RWBY can use to convince the gods to not destroy Remnant if summoned?
No.
So why does this information matter? We don't need an origin story for the gods, especially when it's just dumped in the final episode. It adds nothing to the plot, and something like this should have been regulated to supplemental material since it adds nothing to the actual plot of the show but just expands the backstory that wasn't really all that important. I find it kind of funny while doing research, I found that one of the writers, Eddie Rivas, put out a tweet saying that the theme of volumes 7 and 9 were about failure and self-discovery. And I mean no disrespect to Mr. Rivas here. but I feel like that theming was dropped, or at the very least was applied in not the right way.
What are you talking about?
This is because the last 3 volumes really had to bend over backwards to allow ass pulls, deus ex machinas, and turning people insanely stupid to make Team RWBY in the right. Let's go back in time again, shall we? Blake and Yang leaked information to Robin and giving Ironwood another reason not to trust Team RWBY. RWBY and co lying to Ironwood as soon as they get into Atlas. Ren pointing out that the teams are in situations that are too big and essentially being demonized for it, especially when he turns to adults. No real contemplation of what they did to concerning Ironwood was done the right call. Any sort of being brought up is pushed to the side or forgotten about. There's a lot more, but none of this gets brought up. Team RWBY doesn't actually consider this at all, which arguably a lot of people would consider to be a failure on Team RWBY's part. Let's assume that volumes 7 and 8 were set up and failure. Logically speaking, volume 9 would be the reflection point in a series like this. What does RWBY and co do in response to failure? How do they deal with the fact that they believe they failed in protecting the relics, the people, Penny being killed, and allowing Atlas to fall? Simple. They don't. As I've stated, this volume doesn't really touch on that. Weiss, Blake, and Yang maintain their core beliefs as if they didn't just screw up royally, which is why when they're confronted, they're given such weak confrontations that they can easily just shrug off. Here's the thing about the failure in writing. Not a failure of writing like RWBY likes to do most of the time. It's that when you have a character fail and it's a central theme, you need to have those introspections caused by the failure. It can be as simple as accepting the failure and learning from it, or overcoming the failure and turning into a success of some sort. From my perspective, Team RWBY has been failing and failing and failing multiple times in the last few seasons, only for the writers to be telling us that they're automatically in the right, instead of allowing the audience to come to their own conclusions. They essentially had to make Ironwood into an evil villain, but Team RWBY never once tried to make a compromise with the general. Heck, they spent most of the time just sipping tea while the Atlas army was fighting Salem. And there were ways of making a compromise. Like I said in my Volume 8 review, they had the Schnee Dust Company ships that could evacuate people out of Mantle, and that would have allowed Atlas to go up in the sky while protecting the citizens, the relic, and make sure the Maiden Power was out of Salem's hands. It really comes off as though
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
And in this volume, we're told what is essentially a god entity that they're in the right and should keep going because it's the correct thing that they're already doing. It defeats the purpose of failure when you're told directly by God that what you're doing is alright. You don't learn from your failures. This is literally avoiding the topic of failure and showing that Team RWBY was right all along. Any acknowledgement of failure in the past few volumes has been followed up by a reassurance that what they're doing is right. The writing feels afraid to let the main characters actually make mistakes and take accountability for them. As for the self-discovery, what self-discovery? I'm not going to go in detail about RWBY herself in this section of the video, but even after all the stuff she goes through in this volume, she and the rest of the cast just remain the same as they always are. They don't really change, aside from Blake and Yang becoming a little bit more cutesy and put together. In the previous volumes, they were already uncompromising and had a black and white view of things in the previous volume. We're essentially told that's alright to be that way, and frankly, with how this volume is set up, it's kinda disgusting. Questioning yourself is suicidal. Anyone who questions you must be your enemies, and consequences for your actions, pfft, who cares so long as you feel a little guilty about it because people make mistakes. You're still a good person, you don't need to change. Self-discovery is rejected because you're who you are, but more so. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's seriously the message that this volume pushed to me, and it's honestly kinda disgusting. Which leads us to this point. Legit. Straight up. The whole thing with RWBY, her depression, and how she gets over it. Well, I mentioned it as a positive in the beginning of this video. It devolved into a negative to me over the course of the season. Why? Don't get me wrong, having self-reflection is something that a lot of characters need, and watching it is what makes characters all the better since it allows us, the people, to see that they're not perfect, that they don't have all the answers, that they can grow. However, the way it's done in Volume 9 isn't all that effective, and to me, is really kind of disgusting. Not only for the fact that it seems like Yang, Blake, and Weiss all dropped about half of their IQ points or failed their perception rolls to realize that RWBY was obviously falling deeper and deeper into depression, but the show is really messy with how RWBY just gets over this. so this requires a little explanation. This season, we learn that if the residents of the Ever After get killed or died by anything other than the Jabberwock XB, they come back and come back as something different. And if you're not liking where this is going, then all aboard the crazy train! Ha 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 ha! So Yang, Blake, and Weiss essentially come to the conclusion that this process is good for the creatures of the Ever After, with Jean being against it. And Neo's plan is to push Ruby to the point where she essentially offs herself. Yes, it's exactly what you're thinking. That. Before we get to the actual disgusting part of this, I'd like to point out that I really hate when Rooster Teeth touches this subject matter. The obvious example is when Penny asks John to off her as well. I really don't want to repeat myself for that, as I feel like I addressed this notion pretty well in my Volume 8 review, but for a TLDR, it was disgusting to me and really shaky. And now, we're doing it again. Here's why I think it's bad. This ascension of Ruby doesn't change her. When she comes back out of being turned into a tree, yes, that's how it happens, she essentially becomes vindicated in that she doesn't need to change or grow as a person. Ruby had all her depression and guilt built up. It was shoved in her face by Neo, bringing her to the point where she didn't want to be herself anymore. And by the end, it's all forgotten. There was no reason from feeling the inadequacy as herself to then feeling like being herself is enough 5 minutes later. How did she come to this conclusion?
I love you. Just the way you are.
That was it?!
That's all it took. What I can hopefully assume a good number of people took from Volume 8 is that Ruby and crew had messed up greatly, and that their actions would have consequences and would change the crew to at least reflect on their choices on how they handled the Atlas situation. But Ruby decides to commit Sudoku, or attempts to in episode 8, right in front of her friends. Which, can I say for a moment, they don't do anything to try to stop her? They just stand there like, what the hell are you doing? Punch it! Kick it! Bite its ass! Do something! Hot damn, that brought back some memories. My mic sucked back then. This is really symbolic of how stupid the rest of the cast were this season. We see Weiss somewhat struggling with the destruction of her home and treat Ruby poorly at points, and how that treatment affected Ruby, but does Weiss grow after seeing Ruby breaking down? Nope. But Ruby comforts Weiss when places like the market were destroyed. Blake and Yang find happiness, with Yang reaching out to Ruby and then talking down to Ruby for sounding like Ironwood when her emotions are getting the better of her. Some sister! Blake pushes the group away from talking about how Ruby felt when the curious cat was asking questions. There's no realization to this group as to why Ruby doesn't reach out to them. None of them supported Ruby. No one mentions how Ruby gives away the emblem that she always wears, which was symbolic a piece of her given away to help her friends get back to normal from being shrunk. Something that was, from what I understand, a memento from her mother. None of this gets addressed. Ruby essentially being reset to her happy-go-lucky, depression-free self, which if you really think about it, is kinda disgusting and is on the level of David Cage's Beyond Two Souls level of messaging, where if you're unhappy, just off yourself, kiddies. There's a magical world out there for you once you do that. Nothing is addressed. We never solve Ruby's problems with her friends. They don't question things and only reaffirm the good to move on. We don't address how Ruby didn't open up to them, how her friends didn't really reach out to her at all for the message of just the way you are. You don't need to change, even if you make mistakes. Mistakes that cost the lives of several people, that hurt so many people, that potentially rock the entire world. That to me is so narcissistic and ego-driven, especially with the context of why these characters should change. It's a facade of a character arc, done in one of the most disgusting ways possible in my opinion. And when we get to the final scenes where the team and Jean essentially talk to the real god, and we get that pointless backstory to the two brother gods, they're told they had a greater impact than they know. And while there's a mention of how one act of dishonesty affected someone terribly, it utterly baffles me that no one thinks about that. How their own actions to each other or Ironwood or their friends and family, it just goes through one ear and out the other. Weiss, Yang, and Blake play no part in helping Ruby get over her depression. They don't even apologize for not reaching out to her as much as they should have. There was so much potential in doing that. It would have really affirmed the team aspect of the group. Ruby came back with all her depression erased. There was no longer any need for the rest of the team to take responsibility for her well-being. Nothing was ever wrong with RWBY in the first place. These are our heroes? This essentially tells me that nothing really matters. Anyone can see. Nothing really matters. Nothing really matters to me. You know, there's a bit of a meme with my channel in my last RWBY video with me saying that I'm tired of RWBY and yet I still watch it. You wanna know why I watch the show despite being tired of it, despite all my criticisms of it, despite my opinions on it? It's because I believe that RWBY has a lot of potential to be great. It was originally seen as an incredibly potential product. Back when Rooster Teeth was still getting its feet wet and really inspired countless people to see that they too could get their hard work recognized on the internet. Yeah, the show back in the day was really rough. Its animation wasn't the greatest outside of the fights, the writing was laughable, and even I criticized the first few seasons with a lot of scrutiny. But back in the day, that didn't matter. The show was made with passion, and it actively pushed people to make their own projects and polish their skills because it came off that, yes, you too could get your dream on the screen like this. But nowadays, I don't know, I feel like I've been burned too many times, and if it wasn't for my amazing fans who helped me out and I'm doing this for them, I probably wouldn't even touch this volume, which is sad because there was good stuff to this, there was good potential, but in my eyes I see it squandered. I don't say any of this to be fact. I believe that this is just my opinion. You can disagree with it, but I don't know, it just becomes so jaded. I feel disgusted at this series now, how nothing matters, how our heroes can do no wrong, how they don't actually grow from their mistakes, how they're reaffirmed, how they can be horrible people and be treated as heroes. This volume was pointless. It was nothing. All it did was say to the cast, you don't need to change. And frankly, if the characters aren't going to grow, what's even the point now? I think at this point I really am done with RWBY. Even if Volume 10 comes out next year, I really have no intention of watching it on my own accord. The only reason why I'll watch it is if my fans pay me to do it. I've become so jaded with this series, and it's not just because of the show, it's some other stuff like the fandom that gets on my case, even though I try not to attack them. Even if the show is good, even if the entire next season is great, after so much terrible writing and how our characters don't actually face the consequences of their actions, it'd be too late for me. And that to me is extremely sad. I don't want to say that about any piece of media that I consume. I try to find any positives that I can. But at this point, I don't know what to say. I guess there's only one last thing to say. I'm MangaKamen. Thanks for watching. And always be there with people that you care about. They deserve you, and you deserve them. Peace.